So we're going to move on now to the Quintessential Album Years Albums. Now, this top 10 is a little bit arbitrary. I just think I've put them in the order I think that says the most about the podcast, what we do, what we like, what we don't like, and also in terms of how, relatively speaking, how underrated these records are. Now, bubbling under, we've got a few bubbling under here. Albums that we've evangelized about on the show that generally get overlooked. New Order's Movement.
Yeah.
Debut record. We love that
Arguably
record.
my favourite
New Order record. But it's amazing how New Order fans don't even like that record.
Hated, yeah. I mean, well, that's the album that is the logical follow-up to Joy Division's Closer, which I adore.
Completely. Amazing record. Anyway,
Great
Marvin Gaye's Here, My Dear, the Divorce album.
Well, the story about that one is that he was getting divorced. It was a very costly divorce. And he just gave her the album. So the album was called Here, My Dear. It's like giving them, because all the royalties were going on this. Certain
ratios to each.
That is quite mad. I love the trumpet playing on that.
I love the record. Punk.
Partly we laugh at this because the trumpet playing isn't exactly in tune.
Neither is the singing. Prince, Parade.
What an album, yeah. Beautiful.
What an album. We've evangelized about that. Associate Sulk. You mentioned Associate Sulk.
I'm surprised that's not in the top 10, actually.
It's not in the top 10. No. Well, it could have been. It's a very arbitrary list here. I've gone for a little bit, in terms of, I've gone for eclecticism in the top 10 as well. So things that felt a little bit similar.
Fantastic. Associate Sulk, this is when they'd signed to a major label at this stage and they had the money to what, you think they know?
They know the story. They've listened to the podcast.
They know it. They listen to it every day, don't they?
Yeah, exactly. Stevie Wonder's Secret Life of Plants. You like to evangelise about that one, don't you?
I do like to evangelise about that one. I got in, I think, again, something that I do mention a lot is in Manchester, there was a store called Yanks, and this was a kind of record store that was underground, and you'd go in. It was that high, and you had to actually sneak under. And it sold things for different prices, like 5p to 50p, and it was eclectic. It was all over the show, from funk to classical to progressive, and it was so cheap that we used to go there in our sort of mid-teens and come back with about 20, 30 albums each, and we'd never had the same albums, because we would want to sort of play them as friends and see what we liked. And it's a fantastic way of kind of defining what you like, what you disliked. And Secret Life of Plants was one of those albums that came out, was seen as a bit of a disaster. So it was really cheap for this double album with fantastic triple gatefold, which had me sold already, And it's one of his most unusual records. And interestingly, it was brought up this week where Questlove, the drummer, was saying that sometimes perhaps you just get out of music. Sometimes you feel it's beyond you. And he adores Secret Life of Plants, but his dad heard Stevie Wonder's Secret Life of Plants and had adored Stevie Wonder. And apparently that was it. It was the last new album that his dad ever released. And he thought, right, this isn't for me anymore.
I don't think he was alone. It's quite a difficult in his
almost
catalog.
His relationship with contemporary music.
Do you know, but
album.
There's certain albums in the catalogue of an artist, and maybe Common One is another good example of this. There's certain albums in a catalogue of an artist, almost like a test of the true fan.
Yeah,
that it's brilliant, but it's not for the casual listener. And if you can go with it and you're a fan, very often those are the albums that become your favourites. And let's talk now about, so you mentioned Tales from Topographic Oceans. I think that's a good example.
Yeah.
So the Yes Connoisseur, that's very often one of their favourite albums, us included. But actually for most people, it's the moment that they jump the shark, to coin a phrase.
Yeah.
And there are albums like that we've talked about on the podcast, Common One being another example. And we because we're fans, we love them all the more for that. You feel like you become part of an exclusive club. Let's go through the top 10. I've got number 10. There's about 6 or 7 albums here, and they all share one thing in common. They're all double albums with one track aside.
See, this completely contradicts my idea that the album is perfect between 35 and 45 minutes.
Well, but I don't think you describe any of these albums as perfect, but we love them.
Yeah.
Mike Oldfield's Incantations. What a great album, isn't it? And what's beautiful about that record is it's all derived from the same chord sequence.
Yeah.
And he extrapolates this chord sequence and explores this theme almost like in a fugue-like way through all these different moods, different sort of, musical combinations. And it's kind of like minimalist prog, isn't it? It's got that kind of Philip
it's
Glass
very influenced by Philip Glass, Steve Reich, and even Terry Riley possibly as well. And I think he was very aware of those artists.
Probably covered North Star, Philip
Yeah,
Glass
yeah.
next up.
But I mean, what a beautiful album and very complete. I think, that's an example of a double album that mostly really works as a suite as well, doesn't it? That's something
I
that
adore it,
would have
yeah.
been perfect for the CD age in a way.
So just while we're on the subject, and maybe the audience have some other suggestions, thinking about double albums with only 4 tracks on. I've got Tangerine Dream Zeit, which is my favourite album of all time, famously. Miles Davis, Big Fun.
Yeah.
Sonic Seasonings by Walter Carlos. What a great album that is. Cyborg by Klaus Schulze. And probably the most early example of an album, at least I can think of, that is a double album with 4 tracks. Soft Machine's Third, 1970. I think that might be the first time there was a double album with only 4 tracks on. Number 9, there's a few double albums on this list. There's a triple album coming up later. Steady on.
Welcome back, my friends.
9, A Gift from a Flower to a Garden by the Donovan.
Oh my God, that's beautiful.
How many guys here familiar with that record? Gift from a Flower to a Garden by Donovan. No one. There we
Because
go.
that would have been one of the first artists we bonded about, wasn't it?
Yeah, I thought we talked about it on the podcast.
We did.
No one listens to our podcast, do they? So that's an early example of a career-threatening folly, isn't it? This is an artist that had massive, successful pop singles, suddenly made a double album that came in a box, very expensive to produce, very expensive to buy, and one album of cutesy psychedelic pop, and another record which in some ways is like the precedent for Nick Drake and beautiful acoustic music. Gorgeous song, gorgeous
Well, this
voice.
is it. The first disc, in effect, continued the work you've been doing with Mickey Most. It was a great kind of psychedelic pop album. But the second album, which I think was it subtitled For Children?
Yeah,
Or For Littles
something
or whatever.
like that, yeah. For Little
And
Ones.
this was just utterly timeless material, influenced by kind of Scottish folk melodies and so on. But it's the sort of music you can hear later on in John Martin, in Nick Drake, and arguably at this stage, this is, what was it, 67?
68.
Or 68?
So it might even be 67, I might be right.
But, he's doing this at such a level of grace and spirituality.
But he's
gorgeous.
doing it in the context of being a massive pop star,
Yeah.
mainstream pop star. It's a very brave thing.
And I think with him that in some ways, one of the reasons why it's not seen in the same way as Martin or Drake is partly because of the image, that in some ways he became absolutely entangled with the 60s and almost like a kind of a joke pop figure.
People never forget that scene in the Dylan movie, do they, where he's
Yeah,
ripping
yeah.
Donovan to shreds. Anyway, number 8, Ben Watt's North Marine Drive, talking again about beautiful singer-songwriter, essentially acoustic bass, but with a kind of jazz tinge to it. And what's interesting about this album, Ben Watt famously became a member of Everything But the Girl. This was an album he made before that, before he even met Tracy Thorn and formed the band. And he's about 18 on this record, isn't he, or something? He's very, very young.
But he did an EP before this called Summer into Winter.
Well, and a
which
single
had
too, but yeah.
Robert Wyatt. Yeah, it's somewhere between, if you had to describe it. Unfortunately, it's this kind of this Hollywood thing of, combining the films. But his was almost like the music of early John Martin, or at least peak period John Martin in some ways, the early 70s,
It's got kind of
combined with
bossa
Durutti
nova.
Column.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
And-
yeah.
And then I think
Yeah.
when it comes to North Marine Drive, you've got those kind of Stan Getz bossa nova influences as well.
It's a very bedsitter sound, though, isn't it?
Very bedsitter.
Yeah. Teenager, lovelorn teenager in his bedroom.
Yeah.
7, we have the extraordinary Lewis with his album L'Amour. Now, this was a relatively recent discovery for me, but it shot straight into the album year's top pop charts, didn't it? It's basically what they call outsider music these days, which is music made by people who don't seem to understand the concept of music, which can be fascinating, can't it? Be fascinating. I mean, how do you describe Lewis, Tim?
Well, I think the story is as fascinating as the music. So I think it's this Canadian who used to dress in expensive all-white suits, have an expensive all-white sports car. Was it his? We don't know. And used to actually picture himself alongside kind of all-white private jets. And I think he managed to persuade a studio in LA and a photographer to actually take him in. And he made this album, which is like if Brian Ferry had been given 2 bottles of vodka before a recording session, this is what he'd come up with. So it's almost like Roxy Music's Avalon, but the avant-garde version, it's like you can barely make out a word.
It's completely incoherent, isn't it?
Yeah, but there's something very sensual
It's
about
very
it.
sincere. It
Yeah.
seems very sincere. Anyway, we need
And-
to move on because we're running out of time. So I'm
Oh,
sorry.
right, sorry. But he pressed this himself, and then it was discovered, I think, in a record shop by a label owner years later.
Light in the Attic discovered, 500 copies of it in a warehouse. And
Yeah.
Number 6, talk about, being off with the fairies. And we love albums that are off with the fairies, don't we? Let's face it. John Anderson's Olias of Sunhillow. Is there anything more off with the fairies than that record?
It's difficult to say, isn't it?
It's a beautiful record, though, isn't it?
It always used to be referred to, I remember in Q, as Olias of Accrington, I think, wasn't it?
It's mad, it's pretentious, it's pompous, it's completely off with the fairies. It has no sense of its own absurdity. That makes it a winner for me. Love that record. Right. Nico's The Marble Index. From a recent episode, there's something about that record that doesn't obey any rules. It doesn't obey. And I think albums that don't obey rules sometimes exist outside of time. They exist outside of genre. They exist outside of the zeitgeist. And it was made in 1968. Number 4. This was a very obscure one that I think I brought to the table. I remember bringing your attention. It was made by the bass player from Caravan.
Oh, yeah.
In 1976, a love letter to the Lake District in the UK, an incredibly bucolic, beautifully bucolic record that again seems to, this is when punk was about to start raging. This album was released on a major label. I found it in the Hemel Hempstead Library when I was about 13 years old. And for some reason, they had a copy of this record. And I don't even remember ever seeing it in a record shop, but they had a copy of this record. John G. Perry was the name of the artist. He was briefly the bass player in Caravan. And somehow he got a record deal with Decca, which was a big major label, to make this Love Letters to the Lake District. And it's such, again, an album that exists outside of time, isn't it? It's such a beautifully innocent, naive sounding record. Some big guests on it, there's
Well, it's produced by Rupert Hine, Michael
Simon
Giles
Jeffs
from
is
King
on it, Michael
Crimson
Giles,
is the drummer.
Roger Glover's on it. Roger Glover from Deep Purple.
Well, I think, it comes from, I think if you remember in the late 70s, John G. Perry and Michael Giles were Rupert Hine's chosen rhythm section for sessions. And of course, John G. Perry was also in Quantum Jump, I think.
Yes, he was, yeah.
Yeah.
But that record just the only record he ever made. Obviously, they got dropped by the record label. It's very hard to find even now on vinyl.
If the sort of sound of it is somewhere between Canterbury Music and Penguin Cafe Orchestra.
Yeah, that's a good description. Number 3. Number 3. In fact, number 2 and 3 are kind of, I was pondering which order I would put these around because they're both a little bit two sides of the same coin. Return of the Durutti Column, the first Durutti Column album, and Virginia Astley's From Gardens Where We Feel Secure. Now, interesting, we talked about the bucolic sort of aspect of the John G. Perry album. The Virginia Astley album has it completely too. It's the sound of summers long since past. In fact, there's a track on the album called Summer Long Since Past.
Well, it's almost like music as landscape paintings. It's an English summer day described
in musical
musically.
form.
Yeah, Delius, I suppose, did similar things.
And the Durutti Column album?
Again, there's something very similar, but what's nice about that is I love some of the Martin Hannett production techniques on this, where it's almost like birds, but they're mechanical birds. It's got that kind of David Lynch Blue Velvet, the beginning of the film where there's the mechanical bird. Well,
it's interesting because obviously Vinnie Riley has this very warm, beautiful sort of lyrical guitar style, but it's produced through the filter of Joy Division's producer.
Yeah.
So it has this kind of cold, almost industrial cold sort of, a film over the front of it. But it just works. It's a combination that really works. Number 1 in our list. Could it be anything else? Godley and Creme's triple album, the ultimate triple album folly, the failure of its generation, the last hurrah of the conceptual art rock, progressive rock scene, Consequences. Now this was another album that sort of myself and Tim thought we have to do this podcast just so we can talk about Common One by Van Morrison, but also Consequences by Godley and Creme. Now it's interesting because we've had some I've introduced a lot of people to this album over the years, and I know you have too, Tim. They tend to go in one of either two ways, don't they?
Yeah.
They either completely get it, or they just think you're insane when they've heard it. Now, interesting, I wonder how many people here have listened to the record as a result of hearing us talk about it. Okay. 2. How many of you loved it?
Oh, good.
How many of you hated it beyond belief? There's a few at the back there. Now, see, that's interesting. What is there to hate about it? I don't understand. I think this is the point, isn't it? When we feel passionate about something, we almost feel affronted by the fact that everyone doesn't agree with us. I can't understand why anyone would not like Common One by Van Morrison. I can't understand.
Would you fight someone for it?
I wouldn't fight, no, but I would be very.
You'd
I
throw
would be
some
distraught.
milkshake over them.
I'd be disappointed. I'd be bereft. I'd be bereft.
You'd be bereft as if there'd been a death in the family, wouldn't
I
you?
feel the same way about concerts. And I know we're not alone. There's actually a podcast that's dedicated just to discussing this one album. You've been on it.
I've not been on it, but I know them.
You've been on. I thought you'd been on it.
No, I've worked with them.
Okay. They have a podcast dedicated just to discussions about this album because it's an album that you can analyze endlessly, isn't it? There's so much in it. There's like a comedy skit that Peter Cook voices all. Sorry, sir?
I said Mr. Blint.
Mr. Blint, yes. There's a comedy sequence where Peter Cook basically plays all the characters. It's conceptual. It's also, there's obviously a big connection with technology in the sense that the first record is an exploration of the gizmo, this gadget that they invented. And the first record is like a way for them to show the capabilities of this music.
Well, it was originally intended as a gizmo demonstration.
Well, the first album is a gizmo demonstration. But the sound design, the production on this record, and the funny thing is I know you've talked to Kevin about it as well. They don't like it either. I remember I was in a studio. This is a showbiz anecdote coming up, guys. We need to wrap up in a minute. Showbiz anecdote. I was in a studio. One of the only times I ever got hired as a session guitar player. Why anyone would hire me, I don't know. But anyway, I got hired, and Trevor Horn was the producer. And Trevor and Lol Creme are really good friends. And Trevor said to me about halfway through the session, he said, I hope you don't mind. My friend's coming in. Do you mind if he just sits at the back? He's very quiet. He doesn't get out much. He just wants to sit at the back and listen if you like, if that's okay. And I said, sure. And he said, yeah, it's Lol Creme, by the way. So that blew my mind. So I said, oh my God, Lol Creme. Consequences is one of my favorite albums of all time. And Trevor looked at me and said, I wish you'd tell him that. Because he's been hearing for 40 years what a pile of shit that record is. And he's come to believe it himself. So I actually made a point of going up to him and saying, oh, Lord, I just want to tell you how much I think he thought I was being sarcastic. I tell you how much I love that record. And I hope he's had other people tell him that since. This is about 10 years ago.
Now there's a podcast.
There's a little,
there's
a podcast.
So, yeah.
There's a little swell of enthusiasm for the record.
And there was a website fairly early on.
Yeah, Mr. Blint's Attic.
Yeah.
Mr. Blint's Attic, yeah.